we've got a special guest today, Ian Oppermann, who's going to be talking about fire safes. But what we thought we would do just prior to that, Philip Gould from the Office of the National Data Commissioner has kindly joined us, and he wanted to give us a little quick update in relation to where things are up to with the Act and share with you. So it'd be great to hear where things are at and how the timeline's looking for some of the key milestones.
So thanks for having me. It's a long chat. Basically, I spoke to this group what seemed like an eternity ago, but it was actually only December, so it's been a really busy period for us. That's something that was recently reaffirmed by government, so we're very pleased to see the support for that policy intent. We are working through some arrangements for the governance of the Office of the National Data Commissioner, or the position of the National Data Commissioner, which I think, without being sure, will give us a bit of a delay on the timelines which I gave you last time. Not major delays. I think we're still on track for introduction, let's say to the later end of the middle of this year. So that might be August or September. I'm not giving you a definitive date there, but we're working through some of the implications of the government's arrangements. In terms of the way that we'll be engaging, that continues to be an approach that we're using to really try to use. So we've been developing a paper on the accreditation model that we're working on. The accreditation model is really important. That's the opportunity where researchers and people from government and those outside of government have an opportunity to participate in the system that we're developing. So our intention is to put out a discussion paper at some point, relatively soon, where we will cover issues of who can be accredited, what processes they'll need to go through, so that people who are actually looking to participate in the system will get a strong sense of where that's going. Likely to be after the release of that discussion paper, we will go out with a package for discussion and consultation on the legislation. So that will involve an exposure draft to the legislation, an explanatory memorandum, and having looked at the legislation and the explanatory memorandum, unless you're a pretty keen reader of legislation, you will want the explanatory memorandum, because that really does, to someone like me, make it all make a lot more sense. We'll also release some simpler materials and a schedule of consultations, as well as an independent PIA. We did a privacy impact assessment, which is on our website, which was released last year around the time of our discussion paper. We're doing another one which is based on the legislation itself. So we're really making sure that we're taking a belts and braces approach with putting out that sort of information. So that's a really kind of brief update, basically saying very similar to what I said last time. There will be, I think, some delays in the order of a few months, rather than being more than that. And in the meantime, we'll continue to engage and talk with people about what we're doing. Are there any questions?
Yeah. So mindful of the whole public trust aspect and all that kind of stuff, and I know ONDC are working very hard to, I guess, engage with the public and have a very firm narrative around it. When the public consultation comes out, my understanding is ONDC will provide agencies with some guidance material about how to make that sure that messaging is consistent to stakeholders.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll expect that just before the consultation.
Yeah, so we'll be providing talking points and consistent messaging, and we'll be looking for opportunities with some agencies to bring them along to some of the meetings that we have. For us, one of the interesting things that we're working through, when you consult on legislation, you get a new stakeholder group, which are lawyers largely. So a lot of the people we've been dealing with, we've dealt with a lot of lawyers in our discussions, but there have been a lot of researchers and privacy advocates, but we're expecting to have a new audience, and we're looking at ways that we can details of the legislation, rather they'll be interested in the way we're expecting it to be implemented. So that's a mechanism we're using to manage those two markets.
Because I'm from the Department of Industry, Science and Human Resources, and there has been, I guess, some initial, feedback from business areas in our department around, business and industry concerns about how their data will be used. So we are kind of, potentially anticipating when the public consultation comes out, stakeholders coming to us going, what are you going to do with that data on this bill? So that's why we're mindful of if you guys have some talking points, consistent messaging.
Absolutely, we're working on that sort of material, and it's always much better for us if everyone is actually talking the same.
That's what we really want to have, that consistent messaging that you guys want.
And we appreciate it.
No.
Can I just ask, did you say, Phil, that August would be for the introduction of the bill itself?
I'm giving you a very rough August, September kind of vibe.
And a draft or consultation legislation earlier than that?
Absolutely, yeah. So we as I said last time, we've committed to an extended consultation period. So I would like that to remain around 8 weeks. It might be a couple of weeks shorter than that, but that's a significant consultation period where we will seek submissions. So what we need to do there is make sure that we have sufficient time after the submissions to be able to take on board what we're getting from the submissions and amend the legislation as required.
Just a quick one, will you publish those submissions?
That will be, yeah, absolutely. We've been consistent with all of these things that we publish. PIAs, we publish submissions with the Data Availability and Transparency Act, so we're trying to hold ourselves to a high standard around transparency.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, Phil, once again, I appreciate you taking the time to join us and provide us updates on the progress, and we look forward to regular updates and see how things are going.
Thank you, and I'm going to stick around for here. Fantastic.
For those that attended the first meeting, you remember one of the principles we laid down for the SIG was that we wanted this to be a member-driven SIG. So we asked you around what topics were of interest to you, what you wanted to hear about, and we made a promise that we'd then go out and find the subject matter experts to talk to those topics. We sent out a bit of a poll in relation to a couple of the finalists, and the topic that quite clearly came out that was of interest to the members was around the 5 SAFEs principles. And Dr. Ian Oppermann, who you can just see there having a drink of water, waving to you all, is New South Wales Government's Chief Data Scientist, working within the Department of Customer Service. He's also an industry professor at University of Technology in Sydney. Ian has over 30 years' experience in the ICT sector and has led organisations with more than 300 people delivering products and outcomes that have impacted hundreds of millions of people globally. He's held senior management roles in Europe and Australia as the Director for Radio Access Performance at Nokia, Global Head of Sales Partnering at Nokia Siemens, and the Divisional Chief and Flagship Director at the CSIRO. Well known within the ICT and data circles, and especially around the subject around the 5 SAFEs principles. So we're very happy to have Ian on the line to take us through his presentation. I'll hand over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Can I just check, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Perfect. Fantastic. And I'll also just do a time check. How long would you like me to speak for? Should I just watch people fall off their chairs, or is there a time limit?
I think we'll be able to judge the interest, so we'll give you a signal.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for having me. I actually saw this advertised as Ian Superman, so if you did come to see someone called Superman, I'm terribly sorry to disappoint you. That's the worst mangling of my name I've ever seen, but I was actually not unhappy with it. It's Thursday afternoon, and you probably had a big and busy week already, so what I'm going to do is talk to you about data and data standards, which I figure will be the thing that'll perk you up and keep you motivated and interested. But I thought I'd just give you a little bit of context, first of all. So I have been working with a couple of standards groups around the world. One is ISO and one's JTC1. ISO is a standards group that most people know about. ISO makes standards for smart cities and hearing aids, and believe it or not, even for making a cup of tea, milk first. There's also a group called IEC, who have been around for 100 years, and they care about standards related to electricity and smart lights and heating. And they have a joint technical committee called, believe it or not, JTC1, which has been around for about 35 years. And these guys actually make standards which are really important. Standards related to databases, exchange. Those of you who've heard about SQL will know that's a JTC1 standard, as are the folks who've developed cybersecurity standards, the ISO 27000, ISO IEC JTC1 27000, smart cities, AI, but also things like how would we build the frameworks to create a smart city? How would we do all the things we need to do to have clean water and life above ground and action with response to climate change? But it's also a way of thinking about how we would set ourselves up for the world of 2040 and the world of 2050. And underpinning all of these sustainability goals is ultimately a reframing of the conversation in terms of outcomes. What is it we're trying to achieve? How would we measure those outcomes in terms of the data-driven indicators? And ultimately, how do we build the data assets that we need to understand whether or not we're heading towards or away from those outcomes, and how do those outcomes interact with each other? And Australia has signed up to the UN Sustainability Goals. And one of those goals, of course, is a smart city. And this is a photo taken in Shanghai when I was at the International Standards meeting in October last year, where these groups come together and they're thinking about what do we need to do to get ready for 2030. It was a really prescient and interesting point that this meeting was in Shanghai. But when we're thinking about what we need to do to get ready for 2030, I mentioned the fact that 2030 is not the end of the story. And the UN has done a lot of really good thinking about what the world of 2050 would look like. Today, we have a global population estimated to be approximately 7.5 billion people. By 2050, that world population is expected to grow to 9.5 billion people. So roughly speaking, an extra 2 billion people living on the planet. No more land, no more water, no more natural resources. We have what we have. But we also expect that there are some technologies that will be far more pervasive when we think about the world of 2050. Driverless vehicles, teleworking, teleeducation, telehealth, smart grids, smart factories. And when we put that in a context of a changing climate, a growing, aging, urbanising population, a change in an Australian context of an estimated 7 people working for every 1 person retired today to, by 2050, 3.5 people working for every 1 person retired. There are some pretty big shifts that we are expecting to happen. And as the climate changes, where we can grow food, where we can draw calories from, will also change quite dramatically. And when you start to put these pieces together, what we're actually looking at is the need for a very substantial increase in productivity, especially when we just think about that extra 2 billion people and the ratio of people working to retired changing quite dramatically. And some of these technologies, the driverless vehicles, the telework, the teleeducation, the tele-everything, it's almost unimaginable that the increase in connectivity, the increase in the use of data-driven services, it's unimaginable to think that these will not be used to help achieve that productivity that's necessary to give us, at the very least, an existing standard of living, but of course, an expectation of a growing standard of living. So the reason for taking us to 2030 is that it's a relatively safe place to think about. It's a long way in the future. And we can start to think about what sort of things we would need to start to address, or what sort of services, what sort of technologies we need to address to think about how we would get there successfully by 2050. Of course, 2050 is not actually that far in the future. It's 30 years. That's 1 generation in old speak. And the rate of connectivity, the rate of digitization are all factors that we expect to help us achieve that productivity change. But they're also driving change in their own right. And when you throw artificial intelligence on top of it, then that rate of change is starting to not only accelerate, but that rate of acceleration is starting to change. So what we're seeing is, as we look back to today, from the world of 2050, today is actually the good old days. Today is the period that you will see the slowest rate of change that you will ever see again in your life. With these factors, these global trends of aging, urbanizing, population living more densely together, it's unimaginable that we won't see that rate of change accelerate. So if we take a look now at this next slide, talking about some of those existing technologies that we're being used right at the moment, which almost certainly will help us achieve those productivity enhancements that we need by 2030, 2040, 2050. Autonomous vehicles, we're already seeing them. They're quite cool. They're arguably a lot safer. We've achieved our first billion kilometers in autonomous vehicles, and the impact on life and safety is in fact dramatically less than if we had human beings drive a billion kilometers. But there's some pretty interesting questions that we need to be able to ask around these autonomous vehicles. And that includes, if we think about all the different ways that we now not only reveal information about ourselves, reveal information about, or start to participate in a much more connected environment, then we start to think about really what's appropriate behavior in an autonomous vehicle. What is happening to my personal information? If services are being delivered to me based on where I'm going, where I'm looking, whether or not I've got a dazed expression on my face, where I happen to be gazing, you could imagine a whole suite of very personalized services being delivered to someone, a family driving along in a vehicle, which really start to use either personal information, preference information, relationship information, spatial information, or temporal information as a way of delivering an optimized service, but also starting to change the nature of what we actually mean by personal information and preferences being revealed. And that also has implications when you think about vehicles in a world, a future connected world, where we're trying to ensure that the signal from mobile communications networks gets to every part of that network. Your car might actually be the base station or a hop in a network where the next vehicle and the next vehicle and the next vehicle actually ultimately deliver the signal to the person at the end of the line or the machine at the end of the line. So there are brand new ways of thinking. When I was leaving Shanghai, I went to the airport lounge and was met by this very cute little autonomous device, and clearly quite cool. I walked up to it. I said, "Hello, can you tell me where the bathroom is?" It spoke to me in Chinese. I spoke again, saying I speak English. It recognized I was speaking English and then gave me directions to the bathroom. Not exactly a high-risk engagement. And I thought that was kind of cool. And we certainly are seeing intelligent autonomous devices more and more in different parts of our economy and our society. They've been in manufacturing for quite some time, and more vehicles are made by autonomous devices. And factories of the future certainly envisage having mobile devices which are intelligent and can carry out an increasing range of tasks. The Japanese are certainly looking at them for aged care. They have a very, very substantial profile of an aging population. In fact, one of the most dramatic in developed economies. But we're also seeing them in agriculture, we're seeing them in hospitality, we're seeing them in a whole range of different areas. And again, when we think about that productivity enhancement that we need to have in order to, at the very least, meet the quality of life expectations as we move into 2030, 2040 and beyond, it's unimaginable that these technologies will not become more pervasive. But there are a couple of simple, really important questions, simple but important questions we can ask. This is clearly a robot, but being able to ask the question, can you tell? Doesn't matter if you can tell. Is it a piece of AI? How is this device qualified? Who's responsible for the advice that it gives me? Going to the bathroom, if I get that wrong, that's on me. But if I'm depending on this device in a way where I'm less aware of what it is, and more dependent on the advice it gives me, the question, of course, is who's responsible? Can I trust it? And what's happening to my personal data? In this case, the device recognized the language I was speaking when I spoke to it a second time and responded to me in English. But it might be that my whole experience with this device or this little robot would be vastly improved and vastly more personalized if I gave it access to my wireless-enabled devices, my Bluetooth-enabled devices, my calendar, my contact list. And it could give me a much richer set of services in response to being able to allow access. So those questions about personal information, about consent, and about cybersecurity start to come home again. We move on. This is the last example of a bit of existing technology where these issues start to become really much more complex when we think about the interaction of smart devices. Now, we've all heard about a smart home where you have the toaster connected to the refrigerator. And the toaster, I don't know what a toaster and a refrigerator would actually talk to each other about. But you can imagine this connected home where the toaster is saying, do you want toast? And the refrigerator says whatever refrigerator says back. And I'm sure that conversation is fascinating. But a smart home where you walk in, the lights come on, you walk into the room, lights come on, you walk out, lights go off. Lights go off at a certain time at night, they come on at a certain time at night. You can imagine how you can drive some really personalized functionality and also start to think about, as you aggregate up, if you're a smart lighting supplier, you can aggregate up those different service deliveries by collecting this de-identified data. And you could really do quite a lot in terms of shaping energy demand. That is, in fact, what the toaster and the fridge could say to each other. Don't turn on for another minute whilst we match our demand for energy against the supply coming to us. And all of those little bits of de-identified data are, of course, revealing very small amounts of personal information. In the case of the light, it's when you're home, when you leave home, when you go to bed, when you get up. Is there someone else in the house? There'll be multiple different rooms lit up at the same time. And of course, when you think about not just the smart light or the smart fridge, but your smart bathroom, your smart kitchen scales, your smart bathroom scales, or smart toilet, you could start to think again about some very personalized services which could be delivered to you based on where you are, what you've been eating, a combination of the shirt, the fridge, and the toilet monitoring your health and saying, well, maybe don't go to the fridge this time. And believe it or not, in the world of beyond 5G mobile communications, people are really talking about losing the device and literally making your shirt the mobile device. So it becomes integrated into your life and effectively invisible. But your shirt now not only is your mobile phone, your mobile device, but it also potentially is a hop in the network, just like the car. And it could also measure things like your body temperature, your level of perspiration, and again, provide you very personalized services back to you. But then those questions again, what do we now mean by personal information? Is your proximity to the refrigerator personal information? Is the context around what you're looking at whilst having the refrigerator door open personal information? What are the new issues around cybersecurity? Your shirt could be hacked. So these attack vectors and these attack surfaces, which the cybersecurity folks talk about, suddenly become much more rich and complex. And whilst hacking your shirt may only cut off your communications, the potential for a whole range of new different sorts of invasive or complicating or reliability issues in these networks start to become at least richer in terms of their complexity. What do we mean by data sharing? Do I really consent that my body odor is shared with my toilet or my bathroom scales so that they can come up with a better algorithm about what I should eat? These technologies exist right now. None of these things are made up. Everything of those last 3 pages of examples are technologies that exist now. And as mentioned, as we think about that changing, increasingly connected, increasingly digital, increasingly smart set of services, which we will certainly need to have a greater degree of to meet our challenges of aging, urbanizing population. These are technologies which will become more pervasive. But the questions around personal information, what we mean by it, cybersecurity, what we mean by it, data sharing and what we mean by it, and consent, suddenly take on a much greater richness beyond columns and rows being shared in a database. Let's move to the next slide, please. So I mentioned I spend a lot of my time in the world of standards. And when thinking about those sustainability goals, 2030, of course, is not the end of the line. One of the other things I do is work with the world of mobile communications. So 5G is out. So in many of the major cities in Australia, you can buy a 5G-enabled device, connect to a 5G network. So the Finns, at least, have started working on 6G mobile communications with a target landing date of 2030. So exactly in line with those sustainability goals. And that research community, the initial kickoff amount of money was $450 million to get going with 6G. Those technologies around multi-hop and ubiquitous and invisible technology for communication, but thinking about the world in a hyper-connected way, where increasingly we've got devices of many different types talking to each other, that's the world that's being envisaged right now for ultimately for release in 2030. And along the way, there's some serious work that needs to be done thinking about trustworthiness of those systems, and in particular, as they become increasingly more complex, how they can be guaranteed their operation, how we can continue to drive down the energy consumption of these devices, how we can make integration seamless, and also these systems self-aware. But ultimately, the one I care most about is how we could start to plan in right now, instead of as an afterthought, the concept of preserving privacy when all of a sudden these new dimensions of time and space and context go well beyond the worlds and the domains that we think of as typically columns and rows. But 2030 and 6G is not the end of the line. It's the next step, next big milestone. And we're in a situation where we kind of sort of get a G every 10 years. It's a bit like Moore's Law. So by 2050, world population 9.6, 9.7 billion people. So those extra 2 billion people living on the a reinforcing effect on each other. So again, this is the good old days. Today is the slowest pace of change you will ever see again in your life. We move on, please. Now, I thought I'd just come back to today. We've talked a little bit about 2050. We've talked a little bit about 2030. I thought I'd share just a little bit about what we're doing in New South Wales, and in particular what the Data Analytics Centre has been doing for the last few years. Just to bring it back to this is actually happening now. The Data Analytics Centre has been running for just over 4 years, and we celebrated 4 years in September last year. And along the way, we've had some really interesting challenges thrown at us, what we call wicked policy challenges, so problems that are complex and subtle, but ultimately have people's behaviour at their hearts. We've looked at transport optimisation, we've looked at where to put the next school, we've looked at a whole series of different complex interactive situations, and we're trying to achieve, and we now have these frameworks, so a set of different outcomes that not only we will try to measure individually, but also look at the interaction between those outcomes. We've built some amazing data assets that help us understand which are the factors of risk as we look at the journey of a child, a family, a household. Which of those factors are the risk that drive us towards, or in fact, even away to evolving increasingly sophisticated indicators to tell us whether or not we're measuring what we mean by those outcomes. We've carried out approximately 45 projects over the last 4 years. The one that I actually wanted to spend a moment, 22,000 children in out-of-home care. These are children who've been identified at risk of significant harm, taken away from their families and put into some protective environment. So that's the out-of-home care part. It was costing the state $1 billion a year, and the outcomes were really not good. There was a review done of the entire system and said this system will be reformed, and it will be reformed based on a data-driven understanding of what actually happens to children in out-of-home care. The approach we took was exactly as I've been discussing. We reframed the conversation in terms of outcomes. We said, what are good outcomes for children in out-of-home care? And how would we measure it? And how would we see that journey of every single child who's been in out-of-home care and the related persons in terms of outcomes. 22,000 children at the time, $1 billion annual investment, 44,000 children over 10 years was the first data set we built. We built 44,000 individual journeys and connected those children to 137,000 related persons, all linked de-identified data sets, all linked through the Centre for Health Records linkage in New South Wales using the gold standard for data linkage, and all framed in terms of a conversation of outcomes that we're trying to achieve as open as possible. But acknowledging that that journey of child, family, household is a complex one which touches many or can be seen through many different parts of government. And we're able to see a whole range of different trigger points or different moments when that child's life is impacted. We originally connected data sets across, education, justice, health, and family community services. And whilst that picture looks complex, the reality is every single child had their own journey through those different parts of government. And we realised, in fact, that there were many more parts of government that we need to see in order to get a much better understanding with granularity and specificity of what actually has happened to the child, so that we could start to look at those factors of risk that drive us towards or away from different outcomes. And I have to tell you, this project absolutely hit all the sensitivity buttons you could possibly imagine. Doing it created real concerns about whether we were predicting or determining outcomes for children. Using these different data assets led to concerns about data quality, about appropriate use of data, about appropriate use of insights. But one of the most important challenges which was put to us was actually about privacy. So whilst the voiced concerns were, you've linked all these data sets together, and surely, even though de-identified, you've got enough data in the system that it must be able to reasonably identify individual children or individual family members or individual households. The voiced concerns were, there's a privacy problem here, and surely you've crossed the line of being able to reasonably re-identify individuals. The reality, of course, is most of the concerns relate to sensitivities of data use, data sharing, use of insights, and potential harms or unexpected outcomes. But the voiced concerns are around privacy. Now, just move on to the next slide. And the reality, of course, if we just build this slide out, what it is we've been doing, we can demonstrate. I'll come back to the issues around privacy when I talk about the SAFES model. But where we're going with this is that we've been able to demonstrate over the course of those last 4 years that this is actually an extremely powerful way of understanding what actually happens to people and ultimately closing the loop, one more tap, closing the loop between those outcomes and shaping policy, shaping funding, helping with service redesign, helping with policy redesign, helping with system reform. That ability to see the outcomes through the lens of this of increasingly meaningful, increasingly sophisticated indicators, and understand those fine-grained, high-specificity journeys of child, family, household, community through the lens of data is remarkably powerful to understand points of friction, to understand those factors of risk, and to understand what drives either towards an outcome which is being sought or towards an adverse outcome. But it hits so many sensitivities, so many points of concern around quality, context, about the need to have expert knowledge to interpret the data, you need to have expert knowledge to apply and understand the insights from that analytics, and how far will this decision-making process go from insight to decision? What are the potential harms? Are those harms irreversible or reversible? But the voice concerns are typically about personal information. So some years ago, we started looking at the question to actually respond to the challenge to us of, can we tell if we link de-identified data sets together, some of which will contain personal information, can we tell when we reach the point of being able to reasonably able to identify an individual? If you take eye color, hair color, shoe size, all linked and de-identified, they're actually each bits of personal information, but it's extraordinarily hard to imagine that you can tell an individual from a general population based on eye color, hair color, shoe size. But if you keep linking data sets together around people-centered data, it's not unreasonable to think that you might be able to reasonably identify someone and then put yourself into the world of privacy legislation at state or Commonwealth level. So we asked ourselves the question, could we come up with a measure of personal information, a personal information factor, if you like. And it's turned out to be extraordinarily difficult to come up with this measure, but that hasn't stopped us trying. Next slide, please. And we tried to ask the question of context, because context makes the difference about whether or not a set of linked de-identified data is reasonably re-identifiable. And we've tried to boil down all the different possible contexts that we can imagine down to only 3. And that's a very substantial simplification, but 3 was better than 2, 2 was better than 1. I say that quite lightly. But boiling it down to 3 gives us the ability to say the first environment is a completely closed analytical environment. No more data gets in or out than what you've got. And you can analyze that data and you can look at issues of uniqueness, you can look at issues of how much information is in that data set. But then when you release data or an insight to a human being, whilst you might control who gets access through protocols or through sanctions or through contracts or through a whole range of different screening processes, what you can't do is control the information that's in that individual's brain. And that risk of spontaneous re-identification or that risk of adding other real-world context is something that can't be done irrespective of how you screen the individuals. It can't be done in an absolute sense. And the third contextual environment is when we release data to the outside world, when we put open data out, which all governments do, and that's a fantastic thing. But when we release data to the outside world, there is no longer any absolute guarantees that we can give around which other data sets could be connected to that data, or what effort people will go to try and find other sources or processes to run through. So those 3 contextual settings allow us to have a tightly controlled through people and process, or uncontrolled access to data. And that's been quite useful for thinking about how we would decompose this problem a little further. Move on to the next slide, please. And then we'll try to think about how we would take these different contextual situations and the questions around personal information and apply a risk framework to it. And at the time, the good folks at ABS and various other groups were promoting quite strongly the 5 safes. So we took that question of considering, when doing an analytics project, the dimensions of risk around the project itself. Is it a safe project or not? Do we have safe people or not? Do we have a safe setting or not? Do we have safe data or not? And can we produce a safe output? Because of the work that we're doing at the Data Analytics Centre, and it ranges across so many different things from transport planning and optimization to fire and rescue response times to location of defibrillators around the state, as well as the very sensitive domestic and family violence out-of-home care projects. We asked ourselves the question, if we had not a 100% safe project, but if we had a 50% safe project and a 30% safe person, what would we need to do to the data to change its level of safety and the output of the analysis in order for it to be appropriate for the use case and for the people who have access? So we've been trying for now several years, almost 4 years, to try and quantify what we mean by safe with regard to data and what we mean by safe with regard to people, projects, and outputs. Settings we haven't touched, simply because that relates far more to process, governance, and cybersecurity. But with people and project outputs and data, we have been trying to quantify. We've put out along the way 3 technical white papers, all through the Australian Computer Society. In 2017, we said issues of data sharing and use relate to information theoretic challenges, relate to regulatory challenges or ambiguities, relate to social norms, relate to context, but ultimately relate to trust. And we think these are the dimensions of the problem, and it's not worse than this, it's not worse than that, it's not worse than this, it's not worse than that. It's in here somewhere, but it relates to trust. 2018, we said if we had a measure of personal information, this is how we would start to build those risk frameworks around that measure of personal information, and these are the protections we put in place, and this is what we mean by quantification. Last year, we put out a paper that said, let's try and really identify a practical, if imperfect, still a practical personal information factor, and let's reintroduce some of those sensitivities around data sharing and use, which relate to the data itself, and which relate to the use of those analytical insights and potential harms or unintended consequences. Along the way, we said, in order for us to really build trust in data sharing and use, there's probably some other risk factors we need to consider. Next slide, please. And whilst not wanting to stretch the analogy of 5 safes any further, what we said is that for people to trust what we're doing, we need to demonstrate that us as an organisation are safe. Anyone carrying out that analysis is safe. People trust the Bureau of Statistics, people trust the Institute of Health and Welfare. As the brand new Data Analytics Centre, there was a real deficit of trust because we weren't able to demonstrate that we're a safe organisation. So the organisation itself is the organisation you would think about having the systems and processes in place to ensure those other risk dimensions of people, project, and data and setting and output were actually genuinely being followed, and not just followed immediately, but followed through the entire life cycle of the use of data. And that life cycle is something which is really very important. Because ultimately, when we think about appropriate use of analytics, the life cycle begins at the point of collection. Why did we collect those data sets? Why did we use those data sets? What were the circumstances under which we collected? What was the temperature, the humidity, the sampling rate, the resolution, the accuracy of the data? Was it people who captured the data? Was it a person who received it? Was it a machine who received it? All the way up to that cumulative issue of data quality leading into the analytics process, then to retention, storage, potentially reuse, and ultimately deletion of the data. A really important one was outcomes. Now, I mentioned project. When we think of a project, we argued around this for quite a long time. A project might be a very simple little analytical task. We would like to carry out this for research purpose. We would like to carry this out for an automated decision-making process. We're trying to predict if someone's vulnerable. But if we're not able to put that in the context of why we're doing it, what are the outcomes that we're seeking, such as that out-of-home care case, we might analyse an output, such as analysis of the exit criteria for someone in out-of-home care or where they're likely to end up, so age out, adoption, stable placement, return to family. We might be able to carry out that project and predict that output of a relatively high confidence predictor. But if we can't put it in the context of this is the outcome we are seeking for children at risk of significant harm, this is the outcome set we're seeking for people who've been in out-of-home care, then building trust around the use of the data is something which really comes out of context. And of course, there's the issue around what happens when we use the data, use the insight. Will we, for example, feed it into a decision-making process? Will it lead to an automatic decision? Or is it something that would inform an insight or inform a next project? And that use is really varied. So New South Wales is getting autonomous trains. An algorithm running based on data it's collected says there's a lot of people moving through the door. I will make, from my data-driven insight, if there's a large number of people, I will make the decision as an algorithm to keep the door open for an extra 30 seconds. That's a relatively low context, low harm decision, and therefore something which is appropriate for automated use of a decision as opposed to just use of insight. But again, thinking about out-of-home care, we looked at most likely outcomes for children in the system, age out, adoption, stable placement, return to family. If we use that insight in an automated way as an automated decision, then we would be well outside the realms of appropriate or safe use of that data or that insight. And the last one we looked at was a safe response. This came from a constant reminder that things sometimes do go wrong. Things occasionally lead to unintended consequences. And the response really speaks to the harms that potentially are created through use of a data-driven insight or harms associated with release of data, and how we would respond to that depending on whether the harms are reversible or not, whether they're irreversible, whether they're reversible with some residual cost. So we've been trying to build data governance frameworks that consider the underlying elements, the underlying risk dimensions associated with these different dimensions of risk. We've also been looking at what do we mean by data sharing and use. And believe it or not, there is no standard definition of what it means to share access data. And the language we use around data sharing, data use, data exchange is very often conflated. And when I went to the standards world and said, can you tell me what these different terms actually mean from an international standards perspective, people started scratching their heads and said, actually, there is no standard terminology or vocabulary around sharing access and use. And terms are used in the standards world and in common language interchangeably, to the point where I sat and watched people argue about data sharing when what they actually meant was sharing of metadata or sharing of highly aggregated data products, as opposed to accessing, taking a copy of the data itself. One of the things that we are doing now in the standards world is trying to get much more specific about what we mean by data sharing, data use, data exchange, a work in progress. But I thought, considering we're talking about data and considering there are still people in the room, I'd talk more about the standards side of things. Let's press on. But this is the stuff that's really exciting. This is where we're getting to when thinking about data sharing and use. And that's acknowledging that in almost every jurisdiction in the world, there are some notable examples, but almost every developed economy talks about personal information in terms of the reasonable likelihood of re-identifying an individual, in some cases living or dead. Building considerations and controls based on a measure of personal information from very low to very high, to the point where you're likely to be able to readily re-identify an individual. So it's almost the same as dealing with personally identifiable information. And building considerations and controls around the inherency of the data itself and the use of the data. And we've tried to use things like what we don't want to do is say data around individual groups or vulnerable groups is sensitive in every country. The decisions around that are very much up to the social norms and the context of the economies or the environment people operate in. But the idea is that if you know you have sensitive data, then these are the considerations, controls, and governance framework to start to build, with the objective of being able to work out whether or not we have the data we're dealing with, the insights we'll generate, and the potential harms that are created, whether they're high personal information, low sensitivity, and we put governance frameworks around compliance with privacy legislation, high personal information, in fact, high sensitivity, which is in fact where many people think we actually deal with always with people-centered data, building the sort of ethical frameworks around that, or in fact whether we've got low personal information data and high sensitivity, and I have to tell you things like construction data or even not the defibrillator data sets we looked at in New South Wales, we're in that top left-hand quadrant, or in fact down in the bottom left-hand quadrant where we've got low personal information and low sensitivity data, the sort of stuff that we would reasonably put out as open data. And open data is an interesting point. Again, all governments, at least in Australia, put out open data, and yet we don't actually currently have a measure of how personal that data is. And so we're starting to look at, with our measure of personal information, what are we currently comfortable with and what do we put out? Let's move forward, please. And really, ultimately, it's about thinking about those considerations and controls. This is just an example of one of those, where we looked at 2 dimensions of sensitivity. And in this case, we've identified 10 major dimensions of sensitivity, 2 major dimensions of personal information, and just looking at 2 of those sensitivity vectors, one of which, for example, is the unexpectedness of a result coming out from analysis, and the other one is the amount of context required. How would we build governance frameworks that respect those considerations and put in place appropriate controls? So this was a relatively arbitrary example. If you produced in a very low context environment that automated train a result that said it's exactly as I expect, then the automated process just continues. If you produced a result that was highly unexpected in that automatic train door situation, then you'd run into a fault handling process and you'd have a way of dealing with those exceptions. And that's fine. If we move up the stack to the top part, we're in the high sensitivity area, and we have a result that we expect, then we might say that will form the next project. If we had a highly unexpected result, which was also either had high consequence or required high context, then you'd want to review the data collection process, the analysis technique, the data handling technique, platform issues, interpretation of the results, and you'd probably say, let's run this experiment again or this project again from a different perspective and test it. And the intention of that is, during the course, as you can imagine, at a home care project, we produced some results that really were shocking to people. And rather than say, no, this result will not go out, the intention is that we need to be able to check that we've done everything as we expect, and we are confident about this result, and we now have an agreed mechanism for how we will take it forward and start to use that data-driven insight. Let's move close to the end. Those people who are still awake, move to the next one. And the final question is ultimately around our 5 safes thinking, our risk dimensions. When the first environment we talked about was that closed analytical bottle where data doesn't get in, data doesn't get out. The questions we can ask ourselves is, what do we mean by a safe project? What do we mean by a safe algorithm? What do we mean by a safe setting? What do we mean by safe data? What do we mean by safe output? When we think about those same dimensions of safety, when it's an algorithm that's looking at data sets, generating insights, and then potentially using those insights, there's a lot built into our risk dimensions which assume that human beings are processing, handling, observing, generating insights from data. There's also a lot which assumes that human beings are making that reasonable likelihood to re-identify an individual decision. And that test in law, it probably still will make sense for quite some time that we're talking about human beings. But every other step of the process is potentially replaceable by an algorithm. And the question of what are the risk dimensions and what are the considerations and controls we put in place when it's an algorithm, something which is sometimes a subtle difference, but often is actually quite a dramatic difference. So New South Wales is right in the thick of this conversation right now. And we have just the meeting I had immediately before this one, we were looking at the imminent release of the New South Wales AI strategy, AI policy, and AI how-to framework. And this conversation around appropriate use of data, sensitivities of data, impact and bias of algorithms, appropriate use of output is absolutely at the centre of the conversation about what's appropriate for New South Wales to put out in terms of strategy, policy, and how-to guides. And we think we've done a little more thinking than when we first were thinking about putting out our AI policy and after we had our summit towards the end of it last year. But our ability to start to identify how much further we need to go from the principles to the risk frameworks, principles to the policies to the risk frameworks, all the way down to the bits. We are trying to see whether or not we can genuinely bridge a gap between the high-level principles and the outcomes. This is what we want to achieve, and this is what we're very, very public about, what we're trying to achieve, all the way through those policy risk framework down to the bits. Can we mix this data set with that data set? Can we analyze this data set with our known level of quality for this data? Can we use that data-driven insight to help inform a decision, or can that data-driven insight actually be used to automatically make decisions? We are right in the thick of it. I believe genuinely the front line, thinking through these risk dimensions, the consideration controls, and ultimately the overarching governance frameworks to allow us to bring greater use of data-driven decision-making, greater use of data-driven insights into New South Wales. And with that, I think we're done. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Look, I might just give you a couple of seconds and just ask the room if there's anyone that's got a question, and for those online as well, if you want to unmute and ask Ian a question. We might spend 5 minutes, so we can let Ian get on with the rest of his day. Are there any questions first in the room? Yes.
Ian, I heard you speak at IP Australia last year, where you alluded to some of the data that you were bringing together around child protection. Because it's my PhD background, I was obviously very fascinated, and I still am. So, in terms of using that data, in the US, there's been attempts to use algorithms in child protection type data, and sometimes that's had a unintended consequence of further discriminating against Afro-American people in that case, and probably Hispanic people. But in Australia, where we already have systems which for whatever reason, and they're many and varied and political, that we can end up with, the Northern Territory with every child in juvenile justice is Indigenous. How do you ensure that there's using algorithms in that data set, which ultimately would be very appealing to government, doesn't have those inherent biases built into it?
That's a really great question. As I mentioned, the meeting just before this, we're looking at moving the strategy into a cabinet decision-making process. And despite the fact that we've had the conversation again and again, people naturally have that concern. And the way we've tried to to reground the conversation in New South Wales is to talk about data issues, algorithm issues, and appropriate use issues, and look at all the issues associated with which data sets do we use, what biases do they represent, can we measure those biases, can we measure the data quality, and then when we get to the algorithm, is the data quality appropriate for the algorithm that we're looking to use? What are the sensitivities of the algorithm? What are the biases of the algorithm itself? What are the issues associated with accuracy and specificity and the repeatability of the algorithm? And then finally, if we know something about data quality, sensitivity of algorithm, and all those biases are in that part of the chain, how appropriate is it for us to use this? And the conversation which we just had, and you better believe these folks are passionate about limiting harms from the use of data and algorithms, is whether or not, how confident we are to use data-driven insights at the moment. And we drew a line in the sand, which really is about curtailing individuals' freedoms, which exactly speaks to some of the US cases, and said we will not use algorithms and data-driven insights for that at this stage because we are just not confident enough about these issues of quality. So another way to look at this question is, whilst we talk about data, algorithm, and appropriate use, there are no absolute guarantees of what is meant by data quality or data bias. There are beginning to be better definitions of what we mean by algorithmic bias, and there's a lot of attention being paid to that. But the data part itself, there is currently still, there's some standards work being done in this space. For those interested, it's ISO 8000, parts 1 through 12. I knew you wanted to hear that. But that is still not comprehensive enough for data analytics and even for AI. There's a lot more work needed. I always end these presentations with standards needed because we need to look into it. But as a consequence of that, there is a growing tendency to either expect perfection or to, I guess, to really scrutinize things beyond the question of what government would do without the algorithm and without the data. So the final test we apply is, if we've got a problem with a bias situation, and during our AI summit talked about sepsis prediction, we talked about the identifying vulnerable individuals for Revenue New South Wales to not find them, to do different things. We talked about the potential, the planned building of the NDIS data asset. We said if the challenges we've got, if we take algorithm out and we still have the challenges, if we take data out and we still have the challenges are actually around policy and government as opposed to algorithms and data. So that is a very, very long way of saying that it's complicated. There are growing awarenesses of where bias creeps in and growing awareness of what's appropriate. And so the conclusion in New South Wales was, let's step back from the art of the possible and go with the art of what we're increasingly becoming confident in, and let's move that boundary forward slowly.
We've probably got time for one more question. Anyone on the line wish to pose a question to Ian? Anyone else in the room? I think it just tested the information that we received through the presentation, Ian, and you've probably already answered questions in people's minds, like we've already spoken about. Once again, can you thank Ian for the presentation? Appreciate your time, Ian.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Sorry not to be Superman.
So just in closing, once again, thank you everyone for attending. You're more than welcome to now join us for some drinks and nibbles and networking. The next SIG meeting, we'll set a date, it'll probably be around early May, and we'll release the topic through the DAMA website. Once again, if there's any feedback you wish to give us, any topic that you wish us to find a presenter to present to you about, we're more than happy to take on what you want. Once again, we want this to be your SIG. This is not a PwC presentation. We want this to be informative for you. We're just really the facilitators and the moderators to get you the information that you do need.
Great hosts.
Thank you very much. Look, once again, thank you for coming. Please hang around, get to know each other, share stories, and we'll have a chat there.